The official designation was Class 7 Catastrophic Containment Failure, non-recoverable, and by the time Jonah Pryce read those words on a maintenance terminal 3 decks below the reactor core, 12,000 people already knew what they meant, even if most of them didn't understand the technical language behind them. They meant the Meridian Spire's main reactor was dead, and that within 4 months, once its backup power reserves finally ran out, everyone still aboard the station would need to be somewhere else. The trouble was the evacuation fleet currently docked at the Spire's transit rings had berths for roughly 3,600 people. Everyone else was going to need somewhere to go that didn't exist yet, on a timeline that didn't leave enough room to build it. Jonah had been a maintenance contractor aboard the Spire for 6 years, one of a small handful of humans working among a Corvath station crew that had, for most of those 6 years, treated his presence with a kind of polite, faintly bemused tolerance, the sort reserved for a competent but eccentric specialist whose methods nobody quite trusted even when his results were hard to argue with. He fixed things. He fixed them well, and he fixed them in ways that made the station's certified engineering staff visibly uncomfortable, because Corvath engineering doctrine did not have much room in it for the particular brand of improvisation Jonah had learned growing up around a family salvage yard on a planet where replacement parts were a luxury, and getting something working again with what you already had was simply how machinery survived. He read the Class 7 designation twice, then pulled up the full technical assessment behind it, and by the third read-through, he had started to suspect that the designation was less about what was actually possible and more about what the Spire's engineering core was certified and willing to attempt. Chief Engineer Voth Kalin did not appreciate being interrupted during an emergency briefing, and made that clear within the first 10 seconds of Jonah's arrival at the engineering deck's command office. "Contractor Pryce, this is not an appropriate time." "I read the containment assessment," Jonah said, not moving from the doorway, "the one that says the core's beyond recovery. I don't think that's right." Kalin's mandibles clicked together in the particular way that, among Corvath, signaled barely restrained irritation. The assessment was conducted by a certified engineering team, using standard diagnostic protocols, and confirmed by 2 independent review boards. I understand this is difficult news. It is not, however, news that is open to reinterpretation by station maintenance staff. I'm not trying to reinterpret it. I'm telling you the diagnostic protocols you used weren't designed to evaluate the kind of damage this core actually has. That got Kalin's full attention, if only briefly. "Explain." "Your standard diagnostics assume containment failures follow predictable fracture patterns because Corvath reactor housings are built to fail predictably. It's good design. It's also the reason your assessment protocols never had to account for what happens when a housing fractures the way this one did, along a stress line that doesn't match any of your standard failure models, because it was caused by a micrometeor impact on the outer support strut 8 months ago that never got flagged as reactor critical. I pulled the maintenance logs. Nobody connected that impact to the containment failure because nobody was looking for a connection outside the standard model." Kalin was quiet for a long moment. "You are suggesting the core's condition is less severe than our assessment indicates." "I'm suggesting the core's condition is different than your assessment indicates, in a way your standard protocols weren't built to catch." Different doesn't automatically mean better, but it might mean recoverable if someone's willing to look at it with methods that weren't originally designed around Corvath housing failure patterns. "And you believe you are that someone?" "I believe I'm willing to look, which is more than I can say for the 2 review boards who signed off on an assessment without ever asking what caused the fracture in the first place." Kalin studied him for a long moment, something calculating behind the deliberate stillness of his expression. "Even if your theory has merit, Contractor Pryce, the core has already been certified non-recoverable. Any attempt to access it outside sanctioned repair protocols would violate Station Safety Code, Section 12, and would carry both civil and potentially criminal liability for you and for anyone who assisted you." "I'm aware." "Then you understand I cannot authorize what you're proposing." "I'm not asking you to authorize it," Jonah said. "I'm asking you to look at the maintenance logs yourself, with fresh eyes, before you finish signing off on evacuating everyone who doesn't have a transport seat and letting the rest figure out how to survive on a station that's about to lose main power." Kalin did not authorize an unsanctioned repair attempt. He did, however, spend that evening reviewing the maintenance logs Jonah had flagged, and found himself troubled by what he read, not because it definitively proved Jonah's theory, but because it revealed a gap in the assessment process he couldn't easily dismiss. He raised the concern the following morning with Administrator Jeska Oran, the Spire's senior civilian authority, currently overseeing an evacuation plan that had already begun drawing lottery numbers to determine which 3,600 of 12,000 residents would receive transport berths. "You're telling me there's a contractor who believes the assessment might be wrong," Oran said, not looking up from the lottery allocation figures on her desk. "I am telling you the assessment did not account for a specific impact event that may have caused an atypical fracture pattern. I am not telling you the core is definitely recoverable. I am telling you the certainty behind our current designation is less solid than the review board's language suggested." "And your recommendation?" "I don't have one yet. I have a maintenance contractor requesting access to conduct an independent evaluation, which station safety code does not permit without a certified engineering escort and formal review board sign-off, a process that would take, at minimum, 6 weeks. Oran finally looked up. "We do not have 6 weeks of margin in this evacuation timeline, Chief Engineer. We have 4 months until backup power fails entirely, and every week spent on review board deliberation is a week not spent solving the actual problem of 8,400 people who currently have nowhere to go." "I'm aware of the timeline, Administrator. I am equally aware that authorizing an unsanctioned repair attempt on a certified non-recoverable reactor core based on the theory of a maintenance contractor without formal engineering certification is not a decision I can make unilaterally, regardless of the timeline pressure." Oran was quiet for a long moment, weighing a decision that, Jonah would later learn, cost her more political capital than either of them fully appreciated at the time. "Bring him in," she said finally. "I want to hear the theory myself, before I decide whether 6 weeks of process is a luxury we can actually afford." Jonah's meeting with Administrator Oran lasted considerably longer than he'd expected, most of it spent walking her, in plain, careful language, through exactly what he believed had happened to the reactor's containment housing, and exactly what he thought it would take to confirm it. "I'm not asking for permission to fix it," he said, near the end of the meeting. "I don't know yet if it can be fixed. I'm asking for permission to look properly, with someone certified present to verify whatever I find, so that if I'm wrong, we've lost a few days confirming it, and if I'm right, we've found that out in time for it to actually matter." "And if you're right and it can be fixed, what then?" "Then I want to try, using methods your engineering core isn't certified for, because your engineering core was never trained to fix the specific kind of damage I think this core has. I understand what that means for station safety code. I understand what it means for anyone who helps me if it goes wrong." Oran studied him for a long moment. "Why does this matter enough to you to risk criminal liability over it, Contractor Pryce? You have a transport berth secured, I assume, given your seniority rating." "I do," Jonah admitted. "Wasn't part of my calculation, if I'm honest. I keep doing the math on the other 8,400 people who don't. I've spent 6 years on this station getting looked at sideways every time I fix something with methods nobody trained me in. I've made my peace with that. I'm not willing to make my peace with watching 8,400 people lose their home because the only people qualified to try weren't willing to try something the manual didn't already approve of. You understand that if this fails, and fails publicly, it will not simply cost you your career. It may cost this station's administration, what remains of the population's confidence at a moment we can least afford to lose it. I understand that too. I'm not asking you to bear that risk blindly, Administrator. I'm asking for 3 days. Let me and Chief Engineer Kalin conduct a proper inspection, with full documentation, before anyone commits to anything beyond looking. If the inspection confirms what I think it will, we can have a real conversation about what comes next. If it doesn't, you've lost 3 days out of a 4-month timeline, and you'll have a clearer answer than the one the review boards gave you." Oran was quiet for a long moment, turning that over with the particular, careful deliberation Jonah had come to recognize, over the course of the meeting, as the way she approached every decision that mattered. 3 days, she said finally, full documentation, Chief Engineer Kalin's direct oversight, and a formal report delivered to me personally before either of you takes any action beyond inspection. Is that understood? Understood. I want to be clear about something, Contractor Pryce. I am not granting this because I am convinced you are correct. I am granting it because the cost of confirming you are wrong is 3 days, and the cost of never finding out you were right is potentially unrecoverable. That is the entirety of my reasoning. I would ask you not to mistake it for confidence in your theory specifically. I wouldn't dream of it, Administrator. I'll take 3 days of skeptical permission over none at all. Oren granted provisional access 3 days later, over the formal objection of both review boards, with Chief Engineer Kalin assigned as certified oversight, a compromise that satisfied almost nobody involved, but that nonetheless got Jonah, for the first time in 6 years, standing inside the Meridian Spire's reactor containment chamber, staring directly at the damage he'd spent a week theorizing about from second-hand data. The fracture, when he finally saw it in person, was worse than the assessment reports had suggested, and better, in one crucial respect, than he'd dared hope. Worse because the containment housing had cracked clean through in 2 places, not one, the kind of damage that explained why the standard diagnostic protocols had flagged it as catastrophic. Better because the crack pattern, once he traced it fully, confirmed exactly what he'd suspected. It had originated from a single point of impact stress on the outer strut, propagating inward along a fault line. The housing's standard construction had never been designed to resist, rather than from a uniform failure across the entire containment structure. It's not the whole housing that's compromised, Jonah said, running a hand along the edge of the primary fracture, close enough that Kalin visibly tensed beside him. It's this section, maybe 30% of the total structure. The rest of the housing is intact. Your assessment protocols flagged the whole core as unrecoverable because they're built around the assumption that a fracture this size means the entire containment matrix has failed structurally. It hasn't. It's failed locally in a way that's spreading, but hasn't yet reached critical instability. You're certain of this assessment? I'm certain of what I'm looking at. I'm not certain I can fix it. Those are different kinds of certain. Kalin crouched beside the fracture, running his own diagnostic scanner across the damage with careful, methodical attention, and after several long minutes, straightened with an expression Jonah hadn't seen on him before, something that looked almost like reluctant respect. Your reading of the fracture pattern is consistent with the diagnostic data, he said. I would not have identified it without your analysis. Our standard protocols do not train engineers to look for localized fault propagation. They train us to assume systemic failure, because in Corvath reactor design, localized failures of this severity are exceptionally rare. They're not rare where I come from, Jonah said. Where I come from, you learn to look at what's actually broken instead of what the manual says should be broken, because half the time the machinery you're working on doesn't match any manual you've got. That is either a significant engineering deficiency in your training or a significant advantage, Kalin said slowly. I confess I am no longer certain which. The formal report Jonah and Kalin submitted to Administrator Oren that evening ran to nearly 40 pages, most of it Jonah's own patient documentation of the fracture pattern, cross-referenced against 6 years of maintenance logs he'd pulled personally, because he'd learned long before coming aboard the Spire that a theory without evidence behind it rarely survived contact with people whose job was to be skeptical of theories. Oren read the report twice before calling them both into her office the following morning. You are proposing, she said without preamble, that this station's engineering corps attempt an unsanctioned repair of a certified non-recoverable reactor core, using methods that do not exist in any approved Corvath engineering protocol, developed by a contractor with no formal certification, on a component failure type our own diagnostic training was never designed to identify. That's a fair summary, Jonah said. I want you to understand precisely how unusual this request is, Contractor Pryce. In 31 years of Corvath Station administration, I am not aware of a single precedent for what you are asking me to authorize. I understand there's no precedent, Administrator. I'd also point out there's no precedent for a station losing 69% of its population to a housing shortage nobody's built infrastructure for yet, either. Sometimes the absence of precedent just means nobody's been in this particular situation before, not that the situation doesn't have a solution. Oren was quiet for a long moment, studying the report on her desk with the same careful attention she brought to every decision Jonah had watched her make over the preceding weeks. Chief Engineer Kalin. You have reviewed Contractor Pryce's fracture analysis personally and independently verified his findings. I have, Administrator. And your professional assessment is that his theory is sound. My professional assessment is that his theory is consistent with the evidence and that our standard diagnostic protocols were never designed to evaluate a failure of this specific type. I cannot tell you with certainty that a repair will succeed. I can tell you that the diagnostic reasoning behind attempting one is far stronger than I initially believed possible, and that I am willing to stake my own certification on overseeing the attempt." Oren nodded slowly, and when she spoke again, her voice carried the particular weight of someone who understood exactly how much she was choosing to risk. "Then you have my provisional authorization, under the following conditions. I want daily status reports, delivered to me personally. I want every safety code violation documented and justified in real time, not reconstructed afterward for the review board. And I want both of you to understand that if this fails, the consequences will not fall on either of you alone. They will fall on this entire station's confidence in its own administration, at a moment we can least afford to lose it." She looked between them. "Do you understand what I am asking you to carry, alongside the technical risk?" "We do," Kalen said. "Good, then let's begin." The repair, once Jonah finally convinced both Kalen and, with considerably more difficulty, Administrator Oren that the fracture was survivable, took 11 weeks of work that violated, by Jonah's own rough count, at least 6 separate provisions of station safety code, each violation requiring a fresh round of provisional exemptions that Oren fought for personally, spending political capital Jonah suspected she didn't entirely have to spare. The work itself was unglamorous, exhausting, and dangerous in ways that had nothing to do with dramatic explosions, and everything to do with sustained radiation exposure, structural fatigue, and the particular grinding difficulty of repairing a fracture in a housing material that Corvath engineering had never designed replacement components for, because Corvath engineering had never expected anyone to need to replace a section rather than the entire structure. Jonah solved that problem the way he'd solved most problems in his life, by building what he needed out of what was available, rather than what the specifications called for. He spent the first 2 weeks alone in the station's secondary fabrication bay, working with alloys never intended for reactor containment use, running stress simulations that Kalen initially dismissed as unreliable and eventually, grudgingly, began contributing to himself. "This material was never certified for containment applications," Kalen said, during one of their increasingly frequent late-night sessions in the fabrication bay, examining a patch section Jonah had spent 3 days shaping and reinforcing. "It wasn't certified because nobody ever needed it to be, doesn't mean it can't do the job. It means nobody's written the paperwork proving it can, which is a different problem entirely." Jonah ran a final scan across the patch's stress tolerances, comparing them against the numbers he needed. "This is rated for 81% of standard containment tolerance. It's not perfect. It's not what your review boards would approve if we had time to ask them." "We do not have time to ask them." "No, we don't." Kalen was quiet for a long moment, studying the patch section with the same careful, methodical attention he brought to everything, and Jonah had learned, over 11 weeks of working alongside him, that this particular silence usually meant he was working through an objection rather than dismissing the idea outright. 81% tolerance is below Corvath safety minimums, Kalen said finally. "Under normal circumstances, I would not approve installing a component rated below 90% standard tolerance in a reactor containment structure." "These aren't normal circumstances." "No," Kalen agreed, "they are not. I find myself in the uncomfortable position of having to decide whether 81% tolerance installed now is preferable to 100% tolerance that does not exist within the timeline we actually have." He set the patch section down with unusual care. "I do not enjoy making this calculation, Contractor Pryce. I want you to understand that clearly. I am making it because the alternative calculation, the one where we wait for a solution that meets every certified standard, ends with 8,400 people losing their home. I have decided I find that outcome considerably less acceptable than an 81% tolerance patch, however uncomfortable the decision makes me." Word of the repair effort spread through the Spire's population slowly at first, then rapidly, as the lottery-driven evacuation continued in parallel with a project that most residents understood only in the vaguest terms, a maintenance contractor, and a handful of engineers working impossible hours trying to save a reactor that had already been officially declared beyond saving. Not everyone welcomed the effort. Some residents already holding secured transport berths saw little personal stake in a repair that, if it failed, would only delay an evacuation they'd already prepared for. Others, watching their own lottery odds shrink with every passing week as the population waited to see whether the repair would succeed, grew increasingly vocal in their skepticism. "You're giving people false hope," one resident told Jonah directly, cornering him in a spire corridor during one of his rare breaks from the fabrication bay. "My family's been preparing to leave for 2 months. If this repair fails, and I think it will, you've wasted 11 weeks that could have gone toward finding real solutions for the people who don't have berths." "I understand the concern," Jonah said. "I don't have a guarantee for you. I have a theory, a lot of hours, and a chief engineer who staked his own certification on being willing to test it. If it fails, you're right, we've lost time. If it works, 8,400 people don't have to become somebody else's emergency relocation problem on a timeline nobody's built infrastructure for yet. I think that's worth the gamble." "I understand if you don't." He didn't have a better answer than that, and he knew it, and he carried the weight of that uncertainty through every remaining week of the repair, alongside Kalen, alongside a small, growing team of Corvath engineers who had initially been assigned to the project reluctantly, and had over time become genuinely invested in an outcome that violated nearly everything their training had taught them to consider safe. Administrator Orun faced her own version of that same pressure, in meetings Jonah wasn't present for, defending the continued allocation of engineering resources toward an unsanctioned repair effort, while the lottery system she'd also been forced to maintain in parallel continued drawing names from a population that grew more anxious with every passing week. She told him about it only once, late in the project's 10th week, finding him in the fabrication bay long after most of the repair team had gone to rest. "There is a faction on the station council arguing I should shut this project down," she said, without preamble, settling into a chair across from his workbench, "not because they believe your theory is wrong. Because they believe the political cost of a public failure now outweighs whatever benefit a success might bring." Jonah didn't look up from the patch section he was refining. "What did you tell them?" "I told them that a station administrator who abandons a viable solution to avoid the political cost of trying is not an administrator I am interested in becoming, regardless of what it costs me personally." She was quiet for a moment. "I want you to understand that I am not telling you this so you feel obligated to succeed on my behalf, Contractor Pryce. I am telling you because I think you deserve to know what this project is costing beyond your own hours in this bay, and I think you're the kind of person who works better with that information than without it." "You're right," Jonah said. "I do." He set down his tools, meeting her gaze directly for the first time since she'd sat down. "For what it's worth, Administrator, I don't take that cost lightly. I know what happens to you if I'm wrong. I'm trying to make sure I'm not." "I know," Orun said. "That is precisely why I told you." The final phase of the repair, the actual installation of the patch containment section, and the gradual, carefully monitored restart of the core's primary systems, took place in the Spire's 12th week since the Class 7 designation had first been issued, with roughly 5 weeks of margin remaining before the station's backup power reserves would have been exhausted regardless of the repair's outcome. Jonah stood in the containment chamber's observation gallery alongside Kalen and Administrator Orun, watching a bank of monitors track the reactor's slow, incremental return to active status, each stage bringing its own fresh wave of tension as systems that had been dormant for 3 months came back online one at a time. "Containment integrity holding at 94% projected tolerance," Kalen reported, reading the numbers as they updated in real time. "Core temperature rising within expected parameters. Radiation containment stable." 94%, Orun repeated. "I thought the patch section's rated tolerance was 81%. "It is," Kalen said. "The remaining 70% of the housing, which was never compromised, is performing at full standard tolerance. The combined structure is performing better than either of us fully anticipated, though I would caution against premature optimism until we've completed a full restart cycle." Jonah didn't say anything, watching the numbers climb with a knot of tension in his chest that 11 weeks of exhausting, dangerous work hadn't managed to loosen even slightly, because he understood, better than almost anyone else in the room, exactly how much could still go wrong in the next several hours. It took 9 hours for the reactor to complete its full restart cycle, 9 hours during which Jonah barely left the observation gallery, watching every incremental status change with the particular, focused attention of a man who had spent 6 years being politely tolerated for methods nobody quite trusted, and had finally been given the chance to prove, under conditions that mattered more than any he'd ever worked under, that those methods actually worked. Somewhere in the 6th hour, with the core temperature climbing through a stage Kalen had flagged as the most likely point of secondary failure if the patch section was going to fail at all, Jonah found himself standing beside Administrator Orun at the observation gallery's main viewport, both of them watching the same bank of monitors, in a silence that had stopped being professional several hours earlier and become something closer to shared, private dread. "Can I ask you something, Administrator?" "You may." 11 weeks ago, you granted me 3 days of skeptical permission because the math on waiting didn't work out. I've wondered since then what made you willing to keep extending that permission, week after week, when every review board and half your own council were telling you to shut it down. Oren considered the question for a long moment, her eyes still fixed on the slowly climbing temperature readout. "I have spent 31 years administering this station according to protocols that were, for the most part, sound," she said finally. "Sound enough that I rarely had to ask myself what I would do if they failed me. This crisis asked me that question directly, for the first time in my career, and I found that the honest answer was that I was not willing to let 8,400 people lose their home simply because the solution that might save them didn't come wrapped in the kind of certainty I was used to requiring." She glanced at him briefly. "You reminded me in that first meeting that the absence of precedent is not the same thing as the absence of a solution. I have thought about that distinction more in the last 11 weeks than in the previous 3 decades combined." "Reactor core temperature stabilizing," Kalen's voice cut through the gallery, sharp with barely restrained relief. "Secondary failure threshold passed without incident. Containment integrity holding at 91% and climbing." Jonah closed his eyes briefly, the knot of tension in his chest loosening by a fraction for the first time in 11 weeks, though he made himself hold off on anything resembling real relief until the full cycle actually completed. He'd learned that lesson too, a long time ago, working on machinery that had a habit of failing exactly when you let yourself believe it wouldn't. At the end of the 9th hour, the Meridian Spire's main reactor achieved full stable operation for the first time in 3 months, and the station's primary power grid, dark and running on emergency reserves since the original containment failure, came back online section by section, lights returning to corridors and habitats that had spent 3 months preparing for a slow, managed abandonment that would now, against every early prediction, not be necessary. The formal review that followed the successful restart took considerably longer than the repair itself, a careful, methodical process during which both safety review boards examined every stage of the work Jonah, Kalen, and their small team had completed, cross-referencing it against every provision of station safety code it had technically violated. The final determination, delivered nearly 2 months after the restart, cleared Jonah, Kalen, and the rest of the repair team of any criminal or civil liability, citing what the review board's own language termed extraordinary circumstances justifying deviation from standard protocol, alongside a formal recommendation that Corvath engineering doctrine be revised to include diagnostic and repair methodologies for localized containment fractures. A category of damage the standard training had never previously accounted for. Chief Engineer Kalen was offered, and accepted, a promotion to lead a newly formed division tasked specifically with developing those revised methodologies, an offer he made clear, in his acceptance statement, he would not have been qualified to fill without 11 weeks spent working alongside a maintenance contractor whose training the Corvath Engineering Corps had never formally recognized. Jonah was offered something considerably simpler, formal certification as a senior engineering specialist, a status that would have been unthinkable 6 years earlier, when he'd first come aboard the Spire as an uncertified contractor whose unconventional methods earned him polite, faintly bemused tolerance rather than genuine respect. He accepted the certification, mostly, he admitted to Kalen during the small, quiet ceremony marking the reactor's full return to service, because it would make the next argument easier. "The next argument," Kalen repeated. "There's always a next argument," Jonah said. "Next time something's broken that the manual says can't be fixed, I'd rather walk into that conversation with a certification behind me than have to convince someone all over again that being right matters more than being approved." Kalen considered that for a long moment, the closest thing to a smile that Corvath expressions ever managed crossing his face. "I have spent 30 years believing that certified methods were certified because they were correct, and uncertified methods were uncertain because they were unproven. I have learned over the last several months that the two categories are not always the same thing. I do not know if that lesson will outlast my own career. I intend to spend the rest of it making certain it does." They stood together for a while in the quiet of the newly reactivated engineering deck, watching through the observation window as maintenance crews moved through corridors that had been dark for months, restoring the last of the station's secondary systems now that the primary grid could finally support them. "Can I ask you something?" Jonah said eventually. "Back at the start of this, when I first came to you with the fracture theory, what made you actually listen, instead of dismissing it the way the review boards did?" Kalen was quiet for a moment, considering the question with the same careful deliberation he brought to everything. "I have worked alongside you for 6 years, Contractor Pryce, watching you repair equipment, using methods I did not always understand and did not always approve of. I confess I spent most of those years assuming your results were, in some sense, a form of good fortune rather than genuine competence, because your methods did not match anything my own training had prepared me to recognize as rigorous." He paused. "When you brought me the fracture theory, I found myself facing a choice. I could continue assuming your competence was accidental, or I could finally examine the evidence honestly, on its own terms, rather than through the lens of whether it matched a framework I already trusted. I chose the latter, mostly because I had grown tired of being surprised by your results without ever understanding why they kept happening. And now I understand a great deal more than I did 11 weeks ago, about fracture propagation, about improvised engineering, and about the considerable gap between what our training certifies as correct and what actually works when the circumstances fall outside its assumptions." Kalen looked at him directly. "I do not know that I would have made the same choice you did, Contractor Pryce, if our positions had been reversed. I am grateful, for the sake of 8,400 people, that I did not have to find out." Administrator Oran's final report on the Meridian Spire incident, filed with the broader Corvath Administrative Authority overseeing the station's operations, included a line that Jonah kept a copy of long after the formal proceedings concluded, framed and hung in the small maintenance office that had, over 6 years, slowly become genuinely his, rather than simply a space he was permitted to occupy. The recovery of the Meridian Spire's primary reactor was made possible not by adherence to established protocol, but by a willingness to question it, at considerable personal risk, when established protocol proved inadequate to the actual problem at hand. This station owes its continued existence to that willingness, and to the 8,400 residents who might otherwise have had no home to return to. That debt should not be forgotten simply because the crisis has passed. 12,000 people continued living aboard the Meridian Spire in the years that followed, most of them never fully understanding the technical details of what had saved their home, only that it had been saved, against every early prediction, by a maintenance contractor most of them had barely noticed before the crisis began. Jonah Pryce kept working on the station for another 11 years after the restart, training a new generation of engineers, human and Corvath alike, in the particular unglamorous discipline of looking closely at what was actually broken, instead of assuming the manual had already accounted for every way a thing could fail. It was not, by most measures, a dramatic legacy. It was, he came to believe, exactly the right kind.